And then to what I call my hometown, Gilroy, garlic capital of the world. Apple computers, garlic capital. You know which one's more important. Okay. 19 years at home, 4 years in Spokane, Washington for college on the eastern side of the state. 2 more years back in California. I taught middle school history. I coached football. Then 4 years in Louisville, Kentucky. 3 years for seminary, 1 year more as Kate finished up. Kate and I got married during the fall's research and study break of her 3rd year. 4 Spokane, 2 California, 4 Kentucky, 4 years in Columbus, Ohio for my first church. Boulevard Presbyterian Church. I was an associate pastor. Now, out of order chronologically, right? But Kate, Zoe, and I have lived here in Tosa for 7 years, which is my longest time having lived anywhere since I left home for college in 1997. Now, not counting the time growing up in California, because nobody really ever went around asking high schoolers, so, what do you think about your hometown? Nobody asked them and expected a thoughtful response. Most everyone would go, it stinks here. So minus the first 19 years of life back home, and the total comes to 5 places I've lived as guest invited, in 21 years of time living as a transplant among the natives. And in all those 21 years combined, I'm here to tell you I was never asked what I thought about Louisville or Columbus or Spokane or even here, Wauwatosa, Wisconsin, anywhere near as many times as I was asked, so, what do you think about Punxsutawney? 6 years. Kate and I spent 6 years in Punxsutawney, PA. As you know, home of Groundhog Day. It's my first church solo pastor, a deeply important time in our lives. We welcomed Zoe to our family. We moved here from there. And on every day, not just this day, Kate and I fondly, with love, remember the people, the church, our house, and Groundhog Day. I remember walking to work on my first day there in Punxsy, passing by the Main Street windows. I walked past a place that was selling medical supplies. I had to take a double take. I took a picture. Here's what I saw. In case you aren't sure, yes, that is indeed a ceramic groundhog wearing a CPAP machine. You know, because of sleep apnea. Outside the church, there was a giant plexiglass groundhog I've told you about, Punxsy McPhil's name, bagpipes, kilt, in honor of the Presbyterian Church's Scottish heritage. And that's just the kind of place Punxsutawney was and still is, especially today. Even right now, there's a big festivities going on, and at some point, the mayor will offer weddings where your ring bearer might indeed be a certain prognosticating rodent. When folks would ask about living in Punxsutawney, you know, I never really assumed that they were asking me about the grocery store or the schools. I don't think they ever were really asking about or interested in how there was probably at least 10 pizza places there, but a single Mexican restaurant couldn't make it more than a year or two. When they asked, they did so because I was, as they say, not from around here. And nobody ever was interested in my thoughts about public transportation or nightlife, incidentally, both of which are nearly non-existent outside of the drunks. When folks ask me, hey, how do you like living in Punxsutawney? Or when friends wanted to hear about the town, what I realized was that Punxsutawney was famous thanks to Groundhog Day. Famous, that is, everywhere but Punxsutawney. Have you seen the movie, by the way? Have you seen the movie, Groundhog Day? If not, you should. It is great. But you know, Bill Murray stars as the grumpy weatherman. His name's Phil Connors. I'll admit that when I first saw the movie, I thought his name was Phil Collins. Phil Connors. Phil Connors is sent from Pittsburgh to Punxsutawney to report on the Groundhog Day prognostication. And because of a freak weather storm, he's stranded there. It's a nightmare for Phil, 80 miles from home. And in this magical / unexplained way, Groundhog Day today becomes the only day he's allowed to live. He wakes up the same way day after day, over and over and over. And some people on the internet did the math, which is a great use of the internet. And they placed the number of Phil's repeated days to somewhere around 12,000. Groundhog Day, over and over, day after day, with no end in sight. The movie came out in 1993, and since then, everybody knows about Punxsutawney and Punxsutawney Phil, and the weather forecasting Groundhog, and most every calendar that you buy or get free from your dentist office writes there in tiny font, Groundhog Day, on today's little square. The same day every year, February 2nd. And I'll tell you that maybe not every day, but just about every day, people would visit Punxsutawney. They'd come hoping to touch something familiar about the movie they loved. The awakening they'd experience was rude, to say the least. You see, according to interviews and the stories about the making of the movie, the producers traveled to Punxsutawney and decided that Punxsutawney wasn't quite Punxsutawney enough for the movie. They wanted that quintessential small town with the town square and the Victorian B&B and the mom and pop diner. It all made for great filming locations, and in reality, was that Punxsutawney, which was, of course, the real and true home of Groundhog Day, wasn't Punxsutawney enough for the producers. And it turns out they were not alone. In the movie, the whole Groundhog Day festivities, as you may know, takes place in the town square, smack dab in the middle of town. But in truth, Gobbler's Knob, where Punxsutawney Phil makes his weather prediction, which you could have watched this morning with us via YouTube, Gobbler's Knob is nowhere near downtown. It's not a town square at all. It's a clearing in the woods on the outskirts of town. The dejection on the face of the producers was short-lived. Of course, they pivoted. The Punxsutawney of movie fame, you all were very glad to tell me when we moved here, is indeed Woodstock, Illinois. The folks arriving in Punxsutawney, hoping for a bit of movie magic, apparently did not know that. And they found out the hard way. I remember hearing one young couple at the town gift shop. They were preparing to check out. They were preparing to make their long drive back home. The young woman told the lady behind the register, you know, y'all ought to put up a sign, or at least a warning on the website telling people that this isn't the Punxsutawney we want it to be. We were hoping it was, we assumed it would be. Man, folks wanted that Hollywood Punxsutawney rather than the actual Punxsutawney. The Punxsy where folks lived, like Kate and I, where folks raised their kids and went about their everyday lives, it was that place that the tourists suggested should come with a warning. I remember thinking, what kind of warning? What would we write? Caution. Expectations are held at your own risk. Apropos is not a word I get to use very often, but it indeed was fitting that these fans of the movie would come to Punxsutawney with hearts and minds filled with expectations, only to find them dashed over and over and over again. Because the movie is a story itself about the same day over and over and over again. At first it's comical, but the perpetual Groundhog Day quickly devolves into this kind of hopelessness for the Pittsburgh weatherman, Phil Connors. Every expectation he has goes unmet, both in movie and mortality. The crisis provokes a deep existential dread, and in that way, it makes sense that Groundhog Day, a seminal film, is just about in everybody's lexicon for a faith and film collection. It was required viewing at Kate and my own seminary for a class of the same name taught by the theology professor. The problem friends, is one of expectations. The tourists show up in town wanting what they cannot have. Locals always were wanting me to say that, this town is a lot different than I thought it would be. Movie weatherman Phil expects something seemingly reasonable, a standard 24-hour day, which should be a guarantee, right? That the laws of nature and time and all that, right? The problems are expectations, so the problems are one of suffering. The tourists, the weathermen, the locals who dislike today's festivities all want you to say the same thing. Each of them is struggling. Each of them is fighting. Each of them is failing against the strain of not getting what they want and not wanting what they have. And some things never change, right? Especially so on Groundhog Day. There's a Pharisee in the field. He's among the cornfields awaiting harvest. But not today. No, not today. You can't harvest today. That wouldn't be allowed. It's the Sabbath. That's what the story says. Do not harvest the grain, not even a handful. Isn't it reasonable? Shouldn't it be safe to expect that this guy that some people call rabbi and teacher would know? Another Sabbath, a few more Pharisees in the synagogue. They're not standing in some cornfield on watch, but they're in the house of the Lord, in the worship space, in the synagogue. Perhaps they're expecting the same very things that you are now, here for prayers and psalms and the words of our faith, and thinking, isn't that too much to ask? I imagine most folks would agree that it shouldn't be. Pharisees in the field, leaders in the synagogue, and their expectations are reasonable everywhere. So is that why what they say when Jesus comes close and draws near? As if asking, why are you doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? Why are you're doing wrong? You know that. Is that why they do what they do when Jesus comes to the church? Luke writes that the Pharisees watched him to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. They expect Jesus to know better. They want him to act better. They're hoping that he will be better. It's the Sabbath and gathering grain is forbidden, Jesus. It's the Sabbath and healing is forbidden, Jesus. Is that too much to ask? Is it wrong to expect at least that? And what Luke tells us, friends, is if that's your perspective, Jesus is a disappointment every time. Expectations go unmet. Assumptions are proven false. It's not just here. Luke 4, Jesus proclaims the year of the Lord's favor, and he needs Gentiles too, so they try to kill him. Again, Luke 4, Jesus casts out demons on the Sabbath. He heals on the Sabbath. Luke 5, fishermen become disciples, and immediately after that, in the passage we didn't read last week, sinners are healed, and a tax collector called Levi is now among them, called to follow. Levi gets up, and like the fishermen, leaves everything to follow Jesus. But unlike the fisherman, Levi goes home and throws a big banquet at his house. Is Jesus and some of Levi's closest friends, a table full of tax collectors, which is another way of saying some of the worst people in the world, according to the Pharisees, who are now following Jesus and watching his every move over and over again. Expectations are held over and over again. Every passage and every verse, Jesus should come with a warning. What kind of warning, I wonder? Expectations are held at your own risk. Jesus tells the Pharisees he's the Lord of the Sabbath. It's a day of a different kind of work, an alternative day of service and serving, not a day of abstaining from doing anything. Jesus asked the Pharisees in the synagogue, as he stands next to the man with the withered hand, he asked them, I ask you, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to destroy it? And notice that he's asking a question. Jesus is asking them, so which is it? Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath? Or would you have me continue this man's unnecessary suffering? So which is it? He asks. Can life be saved on the Sabbath, or should I let this life be destroyed because of this man's colossally bad luck of being in the right place on the wrong time, aka the Sabbath, the Lord's Day? Jesus is the rule, friends, not the violation. When it comes to the day dedicated to God's work among us. And the Lord of the Sabbath calls us to eat when hungry and feed those who are likewise, even when the expectations arise as otherwise. The rule is to care for one another, to legislate and make lawful doing good every day and not expect a so-called Sabbath to change that, or I should say, someone to change it for us. I'll tell you what I discovered. 6 years in living in Punxsutawney was that the reality of unmet expectations, of wanting something you thought it would be reasonable to have, only to have those expectations unmet in spectacular fashion, you know what it did? It turned people hostile. It made them mad. One year, disappointed tourists were arrested, vandalizing Gobbler's Knob. College kids drove in from afar. I think it actually was Purdue. Nothing was how it should be. And they were angry. The Pharisees are angry. They're furious even. Jesus poses a threat to expectations. He dashes those expectations over and over and over again, seemingly delighting in doing so. The Pharisees are angry. They're furious, not because Jesus and the few were hungry, but because they went about doing it in the wrong way. Angry and furious, not because a healing isn't wonderful, but because he healed at the wrong time. Expectations are held at their own risk. And some things never change. What keeps more than just Pharisees from celebrating the healed hands or the full bellies, the renewed life or hope or generous giving or growing in numbers or vibrant mission and ministry or commitments to a bright future, even if it's unknown, it's there. It's our expectations. We cling to them far more tighter than we'd like to admit. We say, yes, 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 these are very good things. Healed hands, full bellies, generous giving, growing in numbers, vitality, commitments to a bright future. These are very good things. Yes, yes, yes. We want to see them happen. But maybe not in this way. Friends, day after day, as if waking up on the same, we are given an opportunity. The closer we draw to Christ, the less and less we find our expectations mirrored back to us. We want Jesus to be so many things that we don't let Jesus be who Jesus actually is. The liberator, the giver of life, the Lord of the Sabbath, and the one who saves us. We have an opportunity as the body of Christ to not go out there and delight in meeting everyone's lowest common denominator expectations of following the rules and not talking about this and not doing that. But we have an opportunity to expect that each of us will be more Christ-like and to say what we need to say and do what we need to do, not because the time is right, but because the words are right. For the great and wonderful opportunity of being alive in a time when we can speak and do and act. Thanks be to God.